For those of you who are wondering, that's the southern tip of Lake Geneva. Oh, okay. It's really nice in that spot. Okay, so end of life issues. What I'm going to be talking about are thoughts about death, ethics of pain control. I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. It looks like a lot, but I will be moving through them quickly. Thoughts about death, ethics of pain control, Oregon, the Netherlands, and then physician-facilitated death. Different questions that come up there. Levels in which the physician may be involved, various ways in which the physician might be involved, regulation, the basis in which we would permit this or do permit it. And then, of course, kind of the involvement of the medical profession, about which people have a lot of questions about that. Current practices and implications. I just saw in the paper yesterday that New York State seems to be about to possibly legalize assisted death. There's a big push here in Illinois, a particular group. I don't know if any of you are involved in that group, Compassion in Dying. A couple court cases, developments in France and Canada, and then a glimpse of heaven at the end. Okay. I think only Jeff has seen that if you look through the slides. You didn't see the heaven? Don't. Okay. So a decade ago, a particular publication, a kind of science fiction publication, contacted me and asked me what technological advance will revolutionize medical practice, for which doctors are unprepared. And my answer was the defeat of death. Just a kind of science fiction answer. Why this answer? The reason why I was thinking about that is because our thinking about death has changed hugely over the past centuries. I'm not a historian of thought, so I may not be describing it in the very best way, but I think there have been some significant changes, and I want to talk about that. So first of all, they're clearly, if you approach this within a context of a particular religion, we have an idea. If you do that, then one has an idea of God's plan. It's part of the divine order. And there's something reassuring about that. That tells us that someone is in charge. God is in charge. It's part of God's plan. And we find that reassuring. More recently, in a fully naturalized world, we're not talking about the divine order, but still nature has an order, a recurring order. That's also reassuring. Even more recently, I think a lot of people think, well, what we can say about death is that it's inevitable. Whatever the order is, even if there's no order, death is inevitable. That's also reassuring. But where are we now? I think at this point, we've come around to the view that death is essentially the wearing out of body parts. And I don't know if anyone knew Ray Moses in the linguistics department. Yeah, she and I did some work together. We gave talks on this. She died before we published a paper. But what we looked at was the New York Times as they developed during the 20th century. And it was extremely interesting. By the 80s, one thing that was at the very beginning of New York Times obituaries, and the Times sets the standard for how obituaries should be written, is the cause of death. It was the cause of death. In fact, interestingly, when my mother died, I was in Washington, D.C. with my father right after she died, and we had to do an obituary for the Washington Post. And I called. We had decided what we were going to say, and I called, and the fellow at the end of the phone said, what was the cause of death? And we actually weren't completely clear. It was some kind of lung issue, acute breathing issue. She was a lifelong smoker, and she went very, very quickly. But I finally said acute respiratory event. He said, oh, okay, thank you. So, but also, but that's really interesting. And I don't know when you read obituaries what you look for, but I found myself reading obituaries and thinking, oh, that's what that person died of. I'm going to make a point of avoiding that. So anyway, right now, I don't know how much you are aware of this, but there are a lot of billionaires funding longevity studies. There are some being funded right at Feinberg, other places. And the reason why this is going on is that a number of these guys really want to live as long as they possibly can, perhaps forever, if it's possible to reverse the process. But the question I'm asking is, are we getting to the point where, in fact, death might become a choice? I mean, it is every day, right? Camus wrote about that. Death is a choice. And every day we say no to death. But in a broader, come in, please. In a broader sense, are we getting to a point where it might be a choice? And that actually is not comforting to think about that death might be a choice. And so the question I ask is, how will doctors, if that becomes a choice, how will doctors or clergy counsel patients about this choice? Actually, when I was a teenager, I went to a party with my friends. We were hanging out, and I don't know where this thought came from, but I was having a variety of thoughts, and I said, if in fact they invent a pill that makes it possible for you to live forever, would it be suicide not to take the pill? And my friends thought, wow, that is a really good question. I haven't answered that question. But I asked my classes. I used to ask my classes, and I still do when I meet with particularly high school students in a class. How would you choose? The very first thing they want to know is, well, what age would I be when I finally take that pill? That's the first question that comes up. I want to distinguish between physician-facilitated death and suicide. And certainly, when we started talking about this, we talked about physician-assisted suicide. I find that problematic. Suicide is a very complicated word. It can mean many, many different things. It's perceived very negatively as one fails to deal with the challenges in one's life. It's somehow identified as a failure. But of course, killing oneself can also be heroic, the death of a martyr. Or one can just regard it as descriptively neutral. The act of killing oneself, but leaving out the context that provides possible judgment of how we think about what the person did. So I prefer to use the language physician-facilitated death. I saw that here in Illinois with this group that's trying to push this idea, and in New York State, again in the article this morning, I think it's aid in dying, physician aid in dying is the way people talk about it, who want to further this legislation. So I said also I was going to talk a little bit about the ethics of pain control, and I'm doing this in very general terms. But this is the most basic and classical ethical dilemma at the center of clinical practice, that on the one hand, preserving life often increases suffering, and on the other hand, alleviating pain often hastens death. And that is an unavoidable conflict that often physicians, clinicians are faced with. Until the 1990s, and again, I'm being in very, very general terms, but the law took the view that one should attempt to treat pain, but if increasing the pain medication actually caused death, then you had to stop. And doctors had to be very careful about how they charted how much pain control medication they were giving. I spent a year at Loyola Medical Center back in the 80s. That was the first place that set up a clinical ethics program in Chicagoland. I spent a year there. It was very, very interesting. The culture was fantastic. Loyola is a really great place. In any case, one afternoon, I got a call. I started doing ethics consults there, but I get a call from two doctors who don't identify themselves, and they say they're on the ward, and they have a woman who has very, very serious pain, late-stage cancer, and they've given her as much pain control as they possibly can. Can they continue to increase the pain medication? And I and a colleague talked about it, and we said, we'd be happy to come and talk to you about this, and we can. It was against the law at that point to increase the pain medication to the point where the doctors knew that death was going to occur. In any case, they never called back. So we didn't do anything with that. But clearly, these doctors were in a situation that was very difficult for them. The new law, which came into existence in the early 1990s, is the view that it's acceptable to increase pain medication, even to the point that death is the result. You could increase the pain medication, even if you know that death is going to be the result of the increased pain medication. And this started in Michigan. I had colleagues at Michigan State, and they were part of a whole Michigan ethics network. And they were thinking that this may be the best way to go. And I believe it was unquestionably as a result of the pressure of Kevorkian, who I don't know if you realize was extremely popular in this area. Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, he was a folk hero, very popular. And the nurses really liked him, I should say, the ones I talked to, because it was the time when the view was that doctors were being way too aggressive in their care of patients and trying to keep them alive. And nurses were actually quite uncomfortable with this. So, but what was critical in what I just described in terms of the new law is the intention with which the physician acts. And that gets us to an idea in Catholic moral theology, if anyone's familiar with it, the principle of double effect. And it comes from Aquinas. The idea is that the intention underlying a particular act is good. The unintended bad or evil side effect of an act is still morally acceptable. And as I say, this comes from Aquinas. Previously, pain medication could be increased to the point that the physician knew or believed that it was likely that the patient would die from the effects of pain medication. Currently, the new law, as long as the physician intends to alleviate pain, the death that results from the increase in pain medication is morally acceptable. So that, what's underlying that was that idea of the principle of double effect. And it is the law in every state in the country at this point. Now, it raises an interesting philosophical question, and that is intention versus knowledge. Intention is perceived as fundamentally important, even when the knowledge exists that the patient will die. But what characterizes right action? The intention with which we act, or the knowledge with which we act? And that is a very complicated philosophical issue about which volumes have been written. But I do want to raise this question. What about our immense capacity for self-deception? Can we know our intention with certainty, particularly to the point where we ignore the consequences that we know will occur? And when I talk to college students about this, in terms of their experience, I think Some of them don't recognize the extent to which we can deceive ourselves about our intention, but some of them do. And I don't know if you've had the experience of thinking you did one thing for reason A, and then 4 months later, thinking about it, you suddenly realize, wow, I actually did it for reason B. Maybe that's me. Maybe you don't have those experiences, but I have them all the time. I mentioned here a Chicago case that we saw in the news very briefly. It happened in the western suburb, and there was a woman, end-stage ovarian cancer, in great deal of pain. And she was begging for pain relief. And the doctor had done everything he could for the pain that she was experiencing. Now, this is back, I think this was in the late 80s that I saw this. And the doctor asked the nurse to draw up a syringe of potassium chloride. And he then proceeded to give her an injection of potassium chloride. And if you know, potassium chloride is what they use in the Netherlands to end people's lives. It immediately stops the heart. And she died. And the nurse reported what the doctor had done. He was charged with homicide. And this is where my knowledge of the case ends. I don't think we ever found out how this case was resolved. I think I saw an interview with him very, very briefly. And it was interesting because he said, I acted to end her pain. That's the intention with which I act. If you've been in a hospital recently at all potassium chloride is kept under lock and key. It's not available. And I think anyone who makes use of it has to sign it out and keep track of who has it and what they're doing with it. So, but it is interesting because if he had simply increased the morphine and then increased the morphine some more, and she died, it would not have been an issue investigated by the state's attorney. I think he may have had a suspension for a period of time, is what just as I say, we never really found out. I think it was settled in a way, but I think he did face a suspension for a period. All right, the AMA, now I put up here the 1973 statement because that's the one in the James Rachel's paper that you have. Lost the, oh, thank you very much. This is my son. I told him not to come, but I'm glad he came.
Can I just adjust? Are you guys having trouble when he turns this way, hearing him?
Oh,
I'm just gonna turn this mic here.
thank you. The AMA statement is longer at this point, but this is still the center of it. Just to be clear, the AMA is opposed to physician-assisted death, as well as the American College of Internal Medicine. So they write this: the intentional termination of the life of one human being by another, mercy killing, is contrary to that for which the medical profession stands and is contrary to the policy of the medical association. They go on. The cessation of the employment of extraordinary means to prolong the life of the body when there's irrefutable evidence that biological death is imminent is the decision of the patient and or his immediate family. Now, James Rachel's, in the paper that I gave you, has an interpretation of these two paragraphs. And I think he interprets the paragraphs incorrectly. His interpretation is that in the first paragraph, the AMA is expressing opposition to euthanasia in the act of euthanasia. In the second paragraph, he's saying that the AMA is saying that they're okay with passive euthanasia. And I say he's wrong for this reason. The first paragraph actually doesn't prohibit active euthanasia. It prohibits euthanasia, period, whether it's carried out in an active way or it comes about through lack of action. Because what's important, and this relates to the issue of intention, if your intention is to have someone dead, you can achieve that actively, or you might achieve that passively, as in the case that he gives us of the guy who wants to kill his little nephew, if you read the paper. His nephew's taking a bath, and his plan is to go in there and push his head under the water and kill him. But then when he goes into the bathroom where his nephew is taking a bath, he discovers that the kid has slipped, hit his head on the tub, and has passed out with his head under the water, and he does nothing. And he says, what's the moral difference? And in fact, there really is no moral difference. But what he doesn't realize is that the second paragraph is not about passive euthanasia, but allowing to die. So what we're talking about here is a traditional view of allowing to die. The fact is, doctors so far have not defeated death. At some point, doctors have to recognize that what they're doing is prolonging dying and not really preserving life as such. And they recognize that. That's what they're trying to express here. So treatment stops when one has tried everything and the patient is still dying. And it's also involves a calculation of burden versus benefit. All right, going on now to Oregon. Physician-assisted suicide was legalized in '97. And in Oregon, and probably most of you know this, but a physician can write a lethal prescription if a person is 18 years old, makes a voluntary request. The request is witnessed by someone other than a family member, and a second physician is involved. This is available to people who have been determined by their clinician to be terminally ill with less than 6 months to live. And strict confidentiality is maintained between the physician and the patient. Family members are not included in this discussion, or not made aware of this discussion if that's the choice of the patient. At this point, these are the states where, and the District of Columbia, where this is permitted. And there, as I say, New York State may do it. And, oh, Delaware. Delaware actually is another state that is very close to passing it. I think they did pass it in the legislature. The past governor vetoed it, but the new governor, I think, is going to okay it. Anyway, the question I asked my class once, why is it terminally ill with less than 6 months to live? It just occurred to me, why that? And I asked the class, and I had a student who did an honors thesis with me who tried to answer the question. Miriam Zeidman, fantastic student. She's here in Chicago in a major law firm, did well. What she found, she interviewed a bunch of people in Oregon who were involved in getting that law passed. And what they did is they picked the standard that hospice uses. You become eligible for insurance coverage by hospice when you're determined to be terminally ill with less than 6 months to live. So this was not just out of nowhere. They picked something that was politically already accepted and familiar. I don't know how many of you realize this, but when hospice first came to this country, it was extremely controversial. The perception was, when doctors referred someone over to hospice, that they were abandoning their patient. And now, if you pick up the brochure for Hospice of the North Shore, it's very glossy, covered by insurance. And everyone in the photographs look like they're just came in from playing golf. So I don't quite, it's kind of weird. It's very well accepted. Okay, the Netherlands. Voluntary, as in Oregon, as here. Second physician involved, can terminate life or provide assistance. So in the Netherlands, as you probably well know, euthanasia is practiced. The doctor can actually be an agent of death. Here in the States, the doctor provides the means by which a person ends their own life. But in the Netherlands, a doctor can give a lethal injection. The standard is very different. Intractable suffering. That's what qualifies people for either euthanasia or assistance in dying in the Netherlands, not terminal illness with less than 6 months to live. And people are often shocked by this. This is available to minors aged 12 to 15 with permission of their parents. 15 and 16-year-olds, it's available to them regardless of what their, 16 to 18, sorry, regardless of what their parents want. And I want to just see what your thoughts are about this. If we're actually talking about helping someone die, and we ask what reason should we help them die, how many people say terminally ill with less than 6 months to live should be the standard and make sense? How many people say suffering? Yeah, I think that's what the discussion is really about. And that's what motivates most people to talk about this and want to talk about it. The problem, as might be point, well, let's see. Let me say a little more about the Netherlands. We have neighborhood clinics. Patients are assigned a physician or a physician group. A relationship develops with your physician. The emphasis is on primary care. The Netherlands is an interesting country that has a tradition of, on the one hand, great appreciation for individual life, individual rights, and at the same time, concern about community obligation. There is a national health care plan in the Netherlands, none of which is true here in the United States. I don't know if you know this, but under the Affordable Care Act, Obama tried to include, or the administration tried to include, paying doctors for sitting down with patients or their families and having a discussion about end-of-life choices. Because generally doctors only get paid for doing things, not sitting down and talking. So they wanted to, and there was no agenda involved in this whatsoever. It was just trying to get clear from patients what they would want. Does anyone know what happened with that? Sarah Palin immediately labeled those as death panels. Time magazine labeled it the lie of the year. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, it didn't happen as a result. Questions. What constitutes intractable suffering? Who decides when suffering is such that it becomes appropriate to intervene in this way? And does psychological suffering qualify? The answer is yes. In the Netherlands, psychological suffering does qualify. There was a woman who dealt with incredible, debilitating depression. You know, often we say depression disables a person to make a rational decision, but she spent years of therapy, years of attempts to be helped with drugs, and she finally told her doctor, I'm going to kill myself. And the doctor helped her die. I think she was threatening to throw herself in front of a train or something like that. The mistake he made, and it wasn't a huge mistake, I think he had his license suspended for a period of time, so he didn't consult with a second physician, which is required by law in the Netherlands. But they do recognize psychological suffering because they're talking about suffering. And we know that people do suffer in psychological terms. And this was a paper that appeared in the New England Journal in 2005, the Groningen Protocol, title of which was Euthanasia in Severely Ill Newborns. What they did is they divided infants into 3 categories. Those with no chance of survival, just keep them comfortable and allow them to die as comfortably as possible, which happens here, and is appropriate here. Those are the poor prognosis and dependent on intensive care, and those with a hopeless prognosis who experience unbearable suffering, poor quality of life with sustained suffering. So these pediatricians in this article actually described their practice of providing euthanasia to that third category of infant. And it caused quite a stir. A lot of papers appeared, a lot of people took issue with it, of course. But at this point, this practice is possible in the Netherlands. It's not part of the law, but as a result of a court decision, it is permitted if doctors follow the protocol. All right, levels of physician assistance. The first, there are different ways that doctors can help a person die or be involved in helping a person die, aside from what the law permits. One is information. And, a doctor says to you, whatever you do, don't take 50 of those pills at the same time, followed by a quarter Jack Daniels. That's a way of giving information, important information, and some people want that information. Another is means, and yes, and that's what's available in certain states in the United States and available in certain European countries, the means by which a person can end their life. And then finally, agency, which is available in the Netherlands, as I said, where a doctor actually can give an injection and kill a person, end a person's life. There are three persistent issues that we talk about often in relation to these questions, this practice. One is the regulation of the practice. The second is the basis on which the practice would be permitted. And the last is, as I mentioned before, the involvement of the medical profession. So regulation. One of the questions that comes up here in terms of regulation is equality of opportunity. It presents a challenge. What about people who can't keep pills down? What they would need is, what would be very helpful to them is some kind of injection or something that would help them end their lives. But you can actually go to an official site in Oregon. I don't know if the other states do this, but part of the Oregon law is that there has to be a site maintained. There are no identifiers of individuals, but we do know why people made this choice, how things went. So I remember going to the site and finding that one person took 72 hours to die because he kept vomiting up the pills. In other cases, people went pretty quickly. The reasons, they gave a variety of reasons why they chose this. Often, they don't want to be a burden to their families. And we think, is that a bad reason? I don't want to be, I think it's a really good reason. I do not want to be, I've given my boys very clear instruction to take me out behind the garage and, and just, make it quick. How do we ensure that a voluntary request is actually what we have? But I was just joking about that. But what about those who do perceive themselves to be a burden, possibly emotionally or financially to their families, and are making this choice because of some kind of pressure that they're feeling from the outside, as opposed to something they truly want? And so the question is, how do we know that the choice is truly voluntary? And Timothy Quill, who actually did help a person die, who actually ran a hospice for a period of time, he argues that doctors really need to be trained to have how to have these conversations. And that's probably possible to do. I would agree with him that it is possible. All right, now the basis. People often say, we have a right to die. That's the basis on which this should become available. Well, the problem with that, when we talk about rights, is that generally implies obligation. Someone has an obligation if we have a right. If we have a right to freedom of speech, then others are obligated in some way to let us talk. Right? If we have a right to health care, others are obligated to pay taxes that support my health care. Interestingly, the Oregon law exempts physicians from actually engaging in this practice. And every state in the country that has passed assisted dying has also exempted physicians. So it's kind of odd on the one hand to suggest that you have a right to die, but if you really need to find a physician willing to do this. Otherwise, the right can't really be exercised in any way. But there are problems with equal access and equality of opportunity. What if your physician simply chooses not to provide any assistance in dying? You have to shop around. It seems problematic. Another basis, which I think makes more sense, but has its own problems, is grounded in a physician's traditional role of alleviating pain and suffering. Doctors do act to alleviate pain and suffering. In some cases, because of the increase in the pain medication or whatever, do end people's lives. So the problem with basing this on a so-called compassionate response is who determines when a compassionate response is in order? The patient, the physician, the family. And then another issue that's actually a pretty significant one is, if this is a compassionate response that the physician is making to end this person's pain and suffering, we don't actually have to wait for a voluntary request. And, on the one hand, that sounds pretty disturbing. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it really is. There are people who can't express what they want, who clearly are in pain. I don't know if you've ever been on a ward of the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning where whatever ward it is, but you'll hear people in a great deal of pain and not getting that pain adequately taken care of. And they're actually not able to participate in any discussion. Nursing homes are filled with people who can't participate, but also, as I say, I think are suffering. So it'll be wrong to intervene and end a person's life. I want to say this, and some of you might be offended when I say this. Some of you might say it's true. We do this with our animals, our companion animals that we love. And the choice is always difficult about when we do this and what the signs are that the sign is appropriate. But we do this, and we know that we're giving that animal a gift. We know that. And why that's not possible for each other, I think, is an interesting question. The profession of medicine, should physicians do this? There are lots of ways to commit suicide, aren't there? Actually, no. It's actually quite difficult to commit suicide successfully. I have an acquaintance who jumped out of a window 10 stories above, ended up breaking her legs, and also had some problems on her interior. But surgery took care of that. Her legs healed. Anyway, she didn't die. 10 stories. In fact, if you jump out 10 stories, you only have a 50% chance of killing yourself. Kind of amazing. You go up to 12th floor, 14th floor, you have a much better chance. I'm saying it's not that easy. Guys use lethal means. Yeah. Guys use lethal means, but they usually end up blowing their jaw off, because they put the gun in. They don't complete the job. It's hard, but physicians actually do know how to do this. And in the Hippocratic Oath, this is an issue that's talked about directly, right? It says, I will not give a deadly drug, even if asked for it. Now, what that was about was, something else, not that we're talking. I will say this, it was not a moral condemnation of euthanasia. And it wasn't a moral condemnation of abortion either, what's articulated in the Hippocratic Oath. They were trying to say, you can trust us, we don't do these things. I have the knowledge of how to kill you, but I won't do that. I know how to abort pride abortion. But if you think back to ancient Greece, women were basically the property of their husbands, if they were even on that status, as opposed to being slaves. So when you destroyed the fetus, you were basically destroying the property of a man. And so again, it was about, you can trust us, we're not going to do this. How many physicians are competent? Oh, trust and transference issues. Yes. Your doctor says it might be time for and assisted death, depending on whether they're right about that or not, you may take it in a way you shouldn't, right? But again, Quill has written about this and talked about the need for physicians to be trained to have these conversations, to deal with trust and transference issues, and so on. Current practices with implications. We allow voluntary cessation of food and water. That is, we let patients decide they do not want water, they do not want food. I don't know if anyone ever saw, this was a play that then became a movie called Whose Life Is It Anyway? Back when we rented movies, it was probably the least rented movie in the place. If you did see it, it was Richard Dreyfuss and John Cassavetes played the doctor, and this was in Boston. And Dreyfuss, who had been a sculptor active in a terrible automobile accident, was paralyzed, wanted to die. And Cassavetes refused. No, this is, ways back, and this was in Boston. Cassavetes was a very tough doctor. And Dreyfuss' character goes to court, and the court says, you can refuse food and water. So at the end of the movie, at the end of the play, Cassavetes is sitting by his bedside, and he says, when you get thirsty, when you get hungry, I'm here to give you, because you're going to get hungry, you're going to get thirsty. And that's how it ends. We don't know finally what happened. But things have changed. You can refuse food and water. And clinicians who have experienced this thing working with patients, it's actually not the worst way to go. It's not the worst. But what is that when the physician facilitates that? Cassavetes wasn't going to facilitate it, but now patients get ice chips. They get other things to help them deal with refusing food and water. Is that assisting in their dying? It seems to me it is. And if the aim is comfort, what if there's a physician has done, what if the physician has done, what the physician has done is perceived as inadequate by the patient? Does the physician increase whatever it is that the patient is asking for? And so on. Terminal sedation. That's a way of dealing with these situations as well. The response to pain or anxiety, usually with the patient's request, but not always, a patient will be asked to basically be snowed under. And at some point, they will die. What are we doing there? Are we assisting in death? Or what are we aiming at? Are we aiming, or can we say we're aiming at keeping the patient comfortable? That's our intention, and it's not really to cause death. Gets us back to that principle of double effect and intention versus knowledge of what we're doing. But ostensibly, terminal sedation effort is directed towards alleviating suffering, not ending life. And it's often done in the last stages when a person's dying. That would be the argument of why this is not what we call assisting in dying. It's about making that death easier. But does this really make a difference? Again, what is our intention? And if the focus is on making death easier, what can be included in doing that? How about the withdrawal of food and water? We do allow withdrawal of food and water. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. This wasn't in the 1973 statement of the AMA, but it is there now. And the statement is, all the statement says, it is not unethical to withdraw food and water. It doesn't say why, it just says it's not unethical. But if you stop food and water, and this is the Nancy Cruzan case, if anybody remembers that, what happens? You die. Right? There's no question that you're going to die if food and water is stopped, but that is permitted. 2 years after the Nancy Cruzan case, and you can look it up, check it out, Pope John came out and said withdrawal of food and water constitutes homicide. And I think there's a sense in which he's right. Not that it's not morally appropriate, but it does, the action would, under every other lens, constitute homicide. It was a letter that he wrote. And I'm not Catholic. I'm not quite sure what the what that it means when the Pope writes a letter, but you can find it. Okay, court decisions. One is Vaco versus, there are two court decisions that have dealt with this issue of helping people die. One is Vaco versus Quill, and Quill is the Timothy Quill that I mentioned. Interestingly, he came here and gave a paper some years ago. Eventually it was published, but he continued to help people die. He was doing what Kevorkian was doing, but his credentials were very different. He was a professor of medicine at the University of Rochester. He had worked in hospice. You know, Kevorkian was had going around in his van and was a retired what is it when we look at cells? What doctors, they don't deal with patients, they look at cells and diagnose. Yes, say that again, please. Yes, pathologist. Thank you. Thank you so much. He was a retired pathologist, but yeah, but Quill was really a highly respected physician. Anyway, he helped a woman named Diane die. It's in the New England Journal. If you wanted me to find it for you, just send me an email. And he, in New York State, he wasn't prosecuted because they realized they weren't going to succeed with any kind of prosecution. But anyway, he gave a paper that was really interesting. He had 10 patients who were in various stages of terminal illness. They all wanted assistance with dying. He said that he would help them, give them pills or whatever it was that they would use to help end their lives. And what he reported is of the 10 patients, all of them died of the underlying disease process, not the pills that would have been available if they'd wanted. And his point is what people really want is some measure of control. They want that available as an option if necessary. And I think that's kind of an interesting point. But the question, does New York's ban on assisted suicide violate equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment? That is, anyone who's competent can refuse treatment and possibly die, but others end up suffering a lingering death. In other words, patients, because they refuse, end up having very different kinds of experiences. And Quill was arguing we should equalize it and give everyone an opportunity for a good, fast death, if that's what they wish. Court's response was when a person refuses treatment, he dies of the underlying disease process. The physician who complies with the patient's request does not intend death, but intends to respect the patient's wishes. The same is true when physician aggressively provides pain control and tends to alleviate pain. You see that word, that idea, that concept of intention is so central to these discussions. The choice is grounded not in the right to die, but in the right to bodily integrity. You say, I don't want any more medical intervention. You're not saying you have to help me die. You're saying, I don't want any of this, and the doctor has to back off. What does it mean in practice? That's an interesting question. The other case is this, coming out of the Pacific Northwest, Glucksberg. The question there was, does a liberty interest cover the right to an assisted death? Washington State had, and this was the court's response, Washington State has an unqualified interest in preserving life. The state has an interest in protecting integrity of the medical profession. That's the first 2 points that the court makes. Third, the state has an interest in protecting vulnerable groups, the poor, the elderly, the disabled. And then fourth, they're concerned about allowing this as a voluntary choice, but somehow it being at the bottom of the slope, this issue of euthanasia that may not be voluntary. Interestingly, all the justices concurred in that decision, the Supreme Court, but Stevens, who got his law degree at Northwestern, right? Stevens, he thought the profession of medicine would not be adversely affected if in fact this became legal. And I think that squares with Quill's point, is that patients want to be able to talk to their doctors about possibly having this option available to them if that's what they want. So that's interesting. O'Connor says the liberty interest is legitimate. She says people should have a right to make this choice, but it's outweighed by the concerns of these vulnerable groups that would not be adequately protected. And if you've been reading Dodit in the New York Times, he's had a whole series of articles about Canada. I have to say, according to my colleagues in Canada with whom I've been in touch about what they're doing, they describe him as not being very accurate in terms of what or understanding what's going on in Canada. I'm not making that decision tonight. I'm just pointing that out, that there are people in Canada, a philosopher at York who has followed Dodert and said that he's really not understanding what's going on adequately. All right, France. And some of you may know more about this than I, but France is interesting because you had Belgium and you had the Netherlands coming on board with euthanasia and assisted dying. Switzerland's interesting because they have allowed altruistic suicide, that is helping someone die, since 1905. But they've been adamant that the medical profession in no way should be involved in this. They've kept that separate. So in Switzerland, there are suicide clubs, apparently, where you can go and get help in dying. There was a case that was like a elderly Romeo and Juliet some years ago. The wife in her late 70s was dying of cancer. The husband, who was a very prominent symphony conductor, I'm forgetting the name right now, was not dying, but they arranged their end in this club and they went together, which is kind of sweet. Very romantic, you have to say, at least. Okay, but France has a different view of how this should be handled. And it's kind of the French exception to euthanasia. France, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but generally politically, France focuses on the general will, preserving common values, not so much the protection of individual interests, or at least less so than the general interest. The physicians very opposed to withdrawing treatment, and they're also quite concerned about the legality of withdrawing treatment. French physicians are very uncomfortable with this. Again, this is my understanding from what I've read. Patient autonomy is not as well recognized in France. Yes? Oh, that's all? Thanks. France, patient autonomy is not as well recognized in France. The point is they've developed a position of terminal sedation, where again, the intention is not to kill, but to keep the patient comfortable. You have to ask yourself, do I want to be terminally sedated and kind of disappear from this world without being fully aware that I'm disappearing from this world? Or do I want to be conscious, present, say goodbye to my family, and end it in that circumstance? But that's what it is in France now. Hold on. Canada, bill passed in 2016, legalized physician-administered euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So they have euthanasia and assisted suicide, and the standard is intolerable suffering, which is like the Netherlands. 2 independent witnesses must confirm that it's voluntary. But there's another standard, which is death must be reasonably foreseeable, which sounds like terminally ill with less than 6 months to live. So one of the confusions I find in the Canadian law is, which standard is it? Death is foreseeable or intolerable suffering? And I think they're trying to work that out. So incurable, grievous an irremediable medical condition versus a natural death reasonably foreseen. First part sounds like the Netherlands. The second part is closer to our standard. Okay, questions. We see the states focused on terminal illness, France reluctant to give up ground, Canada initially bold, adding on natural death reasonably foreseeable. Why do we hold on to terminal illness or foreseeable natural death? Terminal illness is irrelevant. We already really touched on that when we were talking about Oregon versus the Netherlands. So where are we? Well, I hope that God knows what God's doing. I hope that God created this life with some kind of meaning, that suffering has some kind of meaning, or without God, that nature and its rhythms have some kind of intrinsic beauty worth embracing, or just plain human pride and being able in the end to somehow find satisfaction in being able to deal with whatever challenges living in these bodies gives us. So real quickly, these are my two uncles, my Uncle Richard on the right and my Uncle Bobby on the left, World War II. Here they are as old guys. Uncle Bobby was a physician, lived till 92, never had any health issues, never. Didn't smoke, didn't drink. Uncle Richard, prostate cancer, finally was told when he turned 80 by his doctors, Dana-Farber, very good place for treatment, that they really couldn't do anything for him. Noah and I actually went to visit him and had a very lovely visit with him. We got back and we got this letter from Richard. Dear friends and family, I wish you to know that the end is coming near for me. I feel completely at ease, he was in a nursing home, about it, and that in itself is a comfort. I'll probably be gone within 2 weeks or a month at the most. What lies before me now is a walk into quietness. I'm sorry I cannot embrace each of you before I go, but now I feel it is time for me to close the door to visitors. I shall miss you all. Uncle Richard. It was amazing to get this note. And every time I read it, I think, I hope that I will be in the same frame of mind when I get to that point. He was a professor of social work at the University of Maine. Helped Head Start in Maine, which is currently whatever. This is heaven. The year, we all know the year the Cubs won the World Series. I want to point this out. You know, unfortunately, newsrooms have been getting rid of their photographers. This was shot, this is the Tribs photo, and it was shot by a regular sports photographer. It is such an amazing photo. What appeared in the Sun Times, where they no longer had an official photographer, was just a bunch of guys running around the ground. This is an amazing photo. Well, thank you. I'm sorry, I realized I was so close to the end. Thank you. Thanks very much for being here. Please email me at Sheldon@Northwestern if you want to continue a conversation. My last name is Sheldon @northwestern.edu, and I'm very happy to continue the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mark Sheldon. That was wonderful.
Mm.
And I thought you were about to tell us that your son was the photographer of this historic site. I do that for my kids.
He's done much better stuff. Yeah.
Okay. So before we get started with questions, we have circulated a number of note cards and pencils. And the way we do this, since we don't want to be walking all around, is if you have a question for Professor Sheldon, please write it on one of these note cards. And Kathy will pick them up and we will get to them. At the same time, we're going to be getting to a number of questions that have been posed online by our online audience. So I'm going to start with some of the questions that we've received online while you're busy filling out the note cards with your own questions. And when you're finished with your question, just raise your hand and we'll come by and pick it up. First question is, will you make your slides available?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And I just want to remind people that this has been recorded or is being recorded, even as, in this case, I speak. And we will be sending out an edited version, edited really just to get rid of some of the housekeeping at the beginning and at the end.
I should mention that my slides are available at some site where students find them all the time. I was a little shocked when I found all my slides, everything available on some website. So, but you won't need to look for that. I'll send them, you'll have them available.
So first question we have is, why does Oklahoma have such a problem executing their prisoners on death row? Do they intend to cause pain?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think there's reason for us to be somewhat suspicious of what actually does happen in those cases. I think what's going on is that, first of all, the AMA is very clear about this. They absolutely are opposed to doctors in any way participating in capital punishment. And I think that's really the right position. They do not want doctors involved. So I think what we often see is a certain amount of incompetence. I think they often have trouble just finding the right vein. You know, a good I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Would be able to do it, but I'm not sure that there are people in the prison competent to do this. So I think that's one of the problems. The other problem is the drugs. And I actually tried, there was a listserv that no longer exists. And I raised the question, why is it that we never see this problem with veterinarians, but we see this problem with executions? And I really wanted to understand this and discuss it. And I keep forgetting to really talk to my vet about it, but they would not, because this particular listserv was a group of ethicists and doctors and philosophers were so opposed to having any discussion of the issue of euthanasia. They were so opposed to it that they wouldn't even have a discussion of it. But I think it's an interesting question, why it is. But part of it is the drugs. And if you follow that discussion, you know that for a long period of time, the drugs come from Europe. Europe does not have executions and would not permit the drugs sent to the United States for the purpose that they're used here in the States. But I think a lot of it has to do with incompetence.
A follow-up question, do medical ethics stop at the gas chamber?
Say that one more time.
Do medical ethics stop at the electric chair or the gas chamber?
I'm a little unclear what the question is, but what I'm thinking is there's an actually interesting discussion. On the one hand, the AMA has said doctors should in no way participate. But on the other hand, if we know that there is incompetence, and as a result, and there's no way to stop the execution, we know that there's incompetence, then is it ethical for a physician actually to be involved? And this issue is being debated in certain circles. I think the AMA remains adamantly opposed. Interestingly enough, in every state in the country, you're dead only when your doctor pronounces you dead, or when a doctor pronounces you dead. There are certain circumstances when you don't need a doctor to pronounce a person dead. One is when the body is basically charred from head to toe, and you're just burned to a crisp. Another is where you get to an accident scene and the body is one place and the head is someplace else. You don't have to wait for a doctor, but there are very few circumstances where a person can be pronounced dead without actually a doctor being involved. So doctors still have to pronounce a person dead after an execution in all these states where they carry this out.
I'm sorry, could you write your question on the card, please? Can you speak to how states or countries with physician-assisted death handle the implications for estate planning?
I don't know specifically in relation to estate planning. That's a really interesting question. I could try to get the answer to that. I do know, interestingly, that in some ways it's helpful if we make that choice in regards to health insurance and cost to the larger society. Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. At this point, suicide is really not illegal. And I think what you can't do is buy an insurance policy and kill yourself within 6 months. Maybe different states have different periods of time, but people get life insurance even if they kill themselves. So a lot of thinking has changed about this.
Okay. Then we have a comment from online regarding the situation specifically in Illinois. Compassion and Choices is the organization supporting medical aid in dying here in Illinois. Senate Bill number 9 is currently moving through the legislative process and may be voted on this session.
Yeah, I've been getting their mail, and if you're interested in supporting this, then they definitely want you to write to your representative.
Okay. Another question from the studio audience. How does the age of the patient affect the decision for the doctor, patient, and family? I assume this is the decision to end.
Are we talking about in the context of assisted dying, or are we talking about just generally how
Yes,
are people dealt with depending on the
that
age?
seems to be implicit in this question.
Yeah, so it may not be about, it's just an end of life issue. I think it's an interesting question. I think it's, as I've done ethics consults at Rush for a number of years, stopped doing that last year. But since the mid-'80s, I've done ethics consults there. And I'm not a clinician, but I'm involved in these discussions. Often I'm involved because doctors don't have time to get involved in these discussions, which is interesting. I think if the person is young, it's very difficult. Very, very difficult. If the person is older, I think it's difficult, but it's not the same thing. And some of you, I don't know, some of you may be doctors, some of you may be nurses and have significant experience with this. But what I've found is that if we're talking about older patients, it's often adult children who don't want them to go. And I've seen this dynamic where the adult child does not want this person to go, and the person continues to hang on because they know that the adult child in some way is dependent on them. You won't be that way. But that goes on. Or another classic is the family, people are ready to let a person go. Again, an older person, not a tragic kind of circumstance where we're talking about a young person who's dying very early. But an adult child will show up from California who has had no contact with this person for 10 years and wants to have one final conversation, and the patient is unresponsive completely, but they want that person brought back to be able to have this conversation. And that happens pretty regularly also. There's a question behind it.
The risk of dying goes up as we get older. However, very interestingly, the cost of care when you die, risk adjusted, goes down as you get older. More care, on average, is delivered for the same degree of disease in someone who's dying when you're younger than when you're older.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. The situation where it may be different is when you have an older person who ends up checking into the ICU and stays there for an extended period of time at the cost of $5,000 to $10,000 a day, and eventually dies, just doesn't leave the ICU. On Netflix, there's actually an incredibly good 30-minute documentary called Extremis. And it's, can't remember what hospital it takes place at, but it's a doctor, her resident, and medical students, and they're dealing with, I think it's 3 or 4 different cases. And it's extremely well done. It's
This
very,
is extremis without the final T.
yeah, Extremis on Netflix. And again, if you can't find it, let me know. But last time I checked about a month ago and it was still there.
This next question is probably addressed to the organizers. You referred to things you sent us to read. What are those readings? So most of you probably received 3 attachments. Well, Professor Sheldon was gracious enough to give quite a few more.
I've been 10. You should have been reading them all.
So there will be a quiz next week. No, so I will be sending out the 3 that we've already sent. A number of comments came in saying they didn't get the reading, so we'll try again. We're also going to add the remaining 7. And there will be no quiz. This is really
I can't
just for
remember
your
what I said, yeah.
information.
Thank you.
Okay.
And if you want more, let me know.
Okay. We might prepare a bibliography to send out to people. So,
Sure.
but these questions, logistical or housekeeping in nature, you can also send to me and we will process them and get things back from Professor Sheldon. So please feel free to use our offices. Yes. We will be sending out the slide pack if it's okay with Professor Sheldon. Yes, I've got it here. Are there residency requirements in states that allow assisted death?
Not that I'm aware of. That's a really interesting question. There is an area, of course, you're probably all familiar. We didn't have this specialty. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but it would have been, again, the period of Kevorkian and changes in the laws. But palliative care is a residency that focuses. Initially, the view was that palliative care focuses on end of life issues, keeping people comfortable as they're dying when it's not possible to do anything more by way of any kind of aggressive medical intervention. Last time I talked with palliative care doctors, it has changed in the sense that, yes, they still deal with that unquestionably, but they also deal with pain. And so palliative care, I think, would be the closest residency that probably is dealing with this. And some people in palliative care are centrally involved in this debate. Those who argue that palliative care is sufficient and a person never has to choose euthanasia or assisted death. Others arguing it can be part of palliative care if a person makes this choice. So it's a good question.
Next question came from our audience here. In US states with physician-assisted death, does insurance cover the procedure and or the medication?
Wow. I don't know the answer. Yeah, I have a feeling it may, but I don't want to say that for sure. It's not a very expensive procedure. You can find bits and pieces. You can piece this whole thing together by yourself on YouTube. It's How to Die in Oregon. Has anyone seen that? Yeah, it used to be on Netflix also, as it's a documentary, and it follows 2 or 3 families in Oregon who make this decision. And it opens with a guy, he's on the porch of the family house, surrounded by his family, and the representative from the state who oversees this presents him with this concoction to drink. And he drinks it and he passes pretty quickly, dies pretty quickly, very peacefully. But I can't imagine that costs anything. It's pretty inexpensive. How to Die in Oregon. What is?
It's a whole lot cheaper than having to pay for all the care as
Yeah,
somebody is dying.
unquestionably.
Great deal for the insurance company.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Well, yes. And for your family, if you've saved some money that you want to go to the grandkids and not to the hospital. I was going to say, over the years, I've taught very controversial topics. I taught both social ethics that deals with capital punishment, so on, abortion, et cetera. And I've dealt bioethics. And, I've always been very clear with students, some of this is going to be intellectually, emotionally, and psychologically challenging. The only time I had a student ever come up to me after a lecture and say that I didn't warn them well enough, I played the first clip from How to Die in Oregon, which shows this man, older man. I mean, it's not a young man. He's an older man who drinks this and dies very peacefully. I told him that this was going to be in the film, but somehow, and I appreciate this, I understand this, he didn't, I guess, expect to actually see someone end their life in a documentary. So I did apologize to him for that, but that's the only time that there was ever an issue.
We're just about out of time. I think we can fit in two more questions. Is there any state where a condemned prisoner can request a medical assisted death?
Boy, I'm not positive about that. If I'd known that I was going to be talking on capital punishment, I would prepare the answer. I do know, from what I've read, again, this is only vague, I think people can make requests for how they will die, like they can request a firing squad. There was a case of a 400-pound man who did not want to be hanged because he was afraid that his head was going to detach from his body. But I don't know, I'm not aware of any place where they could choose. Again, a doctor couldn't be involved, right? Doctors are not involved.
A final question. Do you want to give us a 2-sentence summary of what you want to talk about next week?
Again, I'm going to talk about Jehovah's Witnesses. What happened, a lot of times what I talk about or what I write about are things that are personally significant to me. And I'm getting older now and I'm talking about this. But what happened is that I was looking, early on, this issue of Jehovah's Witnesses and refusal of blood transfusion, both for themselves and for their children, was settled pretty quickly. And then I started thinking, after my sons were born, how can parents refuse a blood transfusion for their children? How can these people do that? And I went through the ethics literature and the court decisions, and I found the justification, and I'll talk about this next week, I found it troubling. And I ended up meeting with elders from a particular congregation in Oak Park, had very, very interesting conversations. And so that's the first part of what I'll be talking about, is this issue of children of Jehovah's Witnesses and parents refusing a blood transfusion, and what arguments are relevant there and how we should deal with it. I'm rethinking it all the time, I should mention. And then as I think I mentioned, I'm going to deal with the vaccine issue. That is also an extremely complicated issue, partly because it's not clear mandates work. A lot of private schools exist purely to avoid the requirement of being vaccinated to attend a public school. There's the issue of, should doctors accept an unvaccinated child into their practice, into their pediatric practice? So those are the things that I'm going to be talking about.
So let's thank Professor Sheldon one more time.
Thank you very, very much for coming.
So we'll be gathering here in this room next week, same time. Many thanks also to our virtual audience for participating and posing questions. And thanks also to everyone who makes this event possible. So good night.